Welcome back, everyone, to the McGill UofT Wellbeing Seminar Series. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. For those of you who have been here already, know what's about to go down, welcome back. As some of our Canadian colleagues will know, it's common to start off seminars with a land acknowledgement. So we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, the McGill UofT Wellbeing Seminar Series started 2 years ago as an initiative of the Canadian Happiness Economics Research Network. I won't go through the whole spiel that I went through last time, but I'll just suffice it to say that this year's seminar will host leading experts from economics, psychology, public policy, and philosophy who work on the conceptualization, definition, and measurement of well-being. And we're really hoping that these talks are going to complement one another with theorists and applied researchers talking to each other and invited to make connections between each other's works. So we're really looking forward to our current and today's speaker, Kristin Cooper, and I'll pass it off to my co-organizer, Anthony, to introduce Kristin.
Thank you, Sophia, and thanks everybody for being here. Before I introduce Kristin, I just want to say, feel free to turn your cameras on if you're not eating lunch and you feel comfortable with that. It's just nice for the speaker and for everybody else to see familiar faces watching as we go through this. We're going to take questions at the end. We should have probably about 15 to 20 minutes for questions at the end. So reserve those questions. If you have any pressing sort of clarification questions as we're going through, feel free to raise your hand or put the questions in chat, but otherwise we'll leave questions for the end. As we're going along, if you've got questions that are coming up, not pressing clarification questions, but just questions that you want to ask at the end, it's kind of nice to get the conversation started, to put those questions in chat so people can kind of respond to them and see them. And then when we get to the end, I'll read those questions out loud or invite you to read your question out loud. That's all the business you need to know. Today we're joined by Kristin Cooper. Kristin Cooper is an associate professor of economics and the academic chair of the Department of Business at Gordon College. She's also a research fellow at UCLA's Behavioral Decision-Making Group at the Anderson School of Business. Kristin's work has encompassed environmental, behavioral, and experimental economics, but her recent work alongside common, frequent collaborators, Daniel Benjamin, Ori Heffitz, and Miles Kimball, has focused on the measurement of subjective well-being, the definitions and conceptualization of subjective well-being, and how it should be put to use in economics and decision-making. So given the theme of this year's seminar series, you can see how lucky we are to have her here. Kristin's work on measurement has been very influential to my own work and many others, so we are excited to have her here today. Welcome, Kristin.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for such nice introductions. And I'm really happy to also have on the call, I see Miles Kimball, one of the co-authors on this project, as well as others, and Ori Heffitz, I think I saw Ori, and Tushar Kundu, who is a former full-time research assistant on our team, and he is now a PhD student at Columbia and on the job market. So food for thought. Our other collaborator, Dan Benjamin, is at UCLA. So I'm really thankful to be able to talk to you today about what people want, an age-old question. The title of the working paper is What Do People Want? I have a little interjection there. What do people say they want? We're studying stated preferences. And we have a lot of people to thank. Thankful for NIH grants and a lot of conference participants at this, as well as others, and our research assistants along the way. So the usual disclaimers apply, as well as my own disclaimer for my talk here, errors my own. So we are studying well-being, and I appreciate the framing of our organizers that we're in the series as a whole, thinking about the conceptualization, the definitions, the measurement. And our team's approach has been to think about well-being as a multidimensional object, which I think a lot of people are on board with. And in this framework, the elements or dimensions of well-being are what we call aspects of well-being. So aspects of well-being are desirable attributes of the state of the world as the individual perceives it. So they have this phrasing. They have a second person framing as well, the happiness of your family, how happy you feel. And I love being in an interdisciplinary setting. All the people on this team are economists, and we are taking a distinctly economic approach, although we're studying non-market goods. So the idea that utility or preference satisfaction is a function of these different dimensions of well-being goes back to a paper that my collaborators published with Nicole Zembrodt back in 2014, which is Beyond Happiness and Satisfaction Toward Well-Being Indices Based on Stated Preference. So the survey that I'll talk about today, as well as some elements of our approach, trace back to that paper. We've made a lot of advances since then, and yet the idea that we would ultimately be able to use these preference-based weights, basically thinking about how much people value all these different dimensions of well-being, the idea that we would eventually have something like an index of well-being where we would properly weight all these dimensions, it really is the overarching goal of the project. So today we're focused on the marginal utility weights, how much people value these, and we're going to try to use the tools of economics to really study desires beyond market goods. So instead of the utility depending on how many cars you have or how much food you eat, it's going to be about desires for the underlying things. As economists, we're going to think carefully about units. So for starters, people want everything, right? And just more and more health for our kids, not worrying about money. Everything could be higher. But at the end of the day, we have to think about units. So there are not natural units for these physical goods. We'll talk about the units that we do use, which are points on our rating scale. So we're going to think about units, and we're taking a marginal approach because for a lot of times we're asking that question, what people want. It could be thought of as what do people want more of? So to bring conceptual clarity to it, we could think about overall wanting as being something like an average, right? Like going from 0 to your current level, but we're really focused on what do people want? Like, what do people want more of? Which is really what the economics approach is best at studying. And I see we had a couple more participants. So hi, I'm Kristen Cooper, and thanks for joining. And I will say if you have questions to clarify things as I'm going through, I'll keep an eye on the chat. Maybe, well, I'll try to do that. And just talking to myself feels kind of funny. So if anybody wants to interrupt me, I am potentially okay with that. But I'm looking forward to your questions at the end. So today we're going to go through the survey. So it's that stated preference, subjective or self-reported well-being approach. We're going to look at marginal utility estimates, and two innovations of this work, especially relative to previous work, are the ways that we're correcting for social desirability bias. That is to say, when people tell us what they want in a survey, it's not necessarily the same as what they would choose, maybe for the way they look to others or even their own self-image. They're kind of putting on a rose-colored glasses of how they would actually make a choice. And then we're going to try to interpret heterogeneity in the marginal utilities, because maybe not everyone wants the same thing, through a lens that we can think of as a supply and demand lens. So stay tuned for that. So the survey design has two types of core questions. We've got ratings and trade-offs. So we've asked people to rate their life on various dimensions. We call them aspects of life. And a rating question looks like this. How satisfied you are with your life is the dimension or the aspect of well-being being rated here. We prompt the respondent to think about the past year and how would they rate this dimension from the lowest level possible, which is 0, to the highest level possible, which is 100. They have to jiggle the slider to set their rating, and it looks like this. They confirm their rating after they have moved the slider. So they make 3 ratings. 3 different aspects. So here's another one, you being able to support your family financially. And after they have 3 rating questions, we ask 6 pairwise trade-off questions. So an innovation here is that we're starting from their current level. And by innovation, I guess I mean survey design challenge that the programmers were able to implement. So they start from their current level, and we ask them, which option do you think you would choose? Option 1 would be to have 8 additional points from 89 to 97 in this example. And physical health in this example is increasing from 92 to 93. This is a trade-off question. A little bit more detail about the trade-offs. So the magnitudes go from 1 to 8. That's the points that we vary. And then they're randomized up or down for a given trio. So we're asking people to compare more of one and more of the other, to a decrease of one to a decrease of the other. And we ask lots and lots of questions. So the results that we're going to talk about today come from a survey where we asked about 126 aspects of life. And these are arranged in blocks. So respondents could actually come back to the survey at different points in time to do more questions of this same format and basically go through this whole list of aspects. Something that I realized that was not intentional about this number, 126. So 126 divided by 3 is 42. So we actually had 42 trios in terms of how the aspects were arranged. And so I think that's a funny number, right, for people who get the Hitchhiker's reference. So we had 42 trios. And the order of the aspects is randomized across respondents. So everybody saw them in a different order. So our data come from a sample from MTurk, from US respondents back in 2022. And we're thankful that we were able to get this fielded when we did. It was prior to the popularity of the large language models. And so we do have quality control filters that we believe to be robust. And our main sample is 896 respondents who passed these filters, including an open-ended text box where they had to explain their reading of something and their interpretation of a question. And they had to answer all of the questions. And we had to be able to estimate the marginal utilities for them. So one of the things, we'll talk more about the estimation in a moment. I'm not going to go into depth on the statistical model unless people have questions on it. And thanks to having Miles on the call, we could tackle the questions if people have those. But I will say, as we're thinking about what kind of data we get, we're going to have a bunch of yes and no, binary choices, right, from those trade-offs. And we have to ask multiple questions to try to pin down the MRSs. And there is going to be response error. So our assumption is not that people can say these without error, but that there's a meaningful underlying marginal utility that we can estimate. So our sample is diverse, but not representative. This is a convenient sample on MTurk. So compared to the US population, they're more likely to have completed college, be younger than 50, be unemployed, and less likely to have annual household income above $120,000 a year, and to be Black or Hispanic or Latino. So we do have a version of this survey that we have fielded on the Understanding America study, where we ask more of the ratings questions. The trade-off questions, if anybody's curious on the Understanding America survey, we only have just a couple of trade-off questions because that survey is so constrained in terms of how many questions we can offer. So one of the benefits of this sample is that we really could go back to the same respondents for a relatively modest cost and get a lot of data on these aspects to estimate these marginal utilities. Okay, so let's dive in to the marginal utility estimates. So this is a table showing the top 20, and the first column has the aspects. We'll talk about the color in a moment, but in orange, it's the aspects that would be related to having children, and then the green is related to having a spouse or a partner. The other ones do mention family, a lot of them, but they're not about a specific family member. So we think of them as being interpretable for all individuals. The second column has the marginal utility estimate. That's the first number, and then the confidence interval, the lower bound and the upper bound. And the third column has the rank. So that's what the table is sorted by. It's sorted by the marginal utility rank, and this is measured in points. So what this means, your children's health aspect, 66.9. So on average, so these are for the whole sample, on average, people are willing to trade off for a point of the average aspect. For a point of your children's health, it would take 67 points of the average aspect to make up for that. So we could say your children's health is 67 times more important, point for point, than the average aspect. So it's a large number, and we're going to talk more about that specific number. But it kind of makes sense for those of us who have kids. Like, would you give up a point of your children's health for any other question? It seems very plausible that people are basically not willing to do that. The last column is related to the response error. So sigma J is at the aspect level. It's the estimated standard deviation of the individual level log marginal utility for that aspect. So we do estimate individual log marginal utilities, and there's some structure on it. There's a hierarchical model, so because we couldn't estimate this without some structure. But the estimated standard deviation by aspect is basically telling us where there's more variation across people in terms of the marginal utilities. So it seems very plausible then that the highest ones here that are in orange, related to children's health and children's happiness and having a strong bond, there's more variation in how important these are to people, presumably because some people don't have kids, so they're not putting the same weight on those. Same for the spouse and partner's health one. For people who have a spouse or partner, it's very important, but some people who don't have one, or maybe for whom that question was ambiguous, they would give a lower value. Interestingly, the lowest aspect level estimated standard deviation of log margin utility is your physical health out of these top 20. So that's 4.18 at the very bottom. So just summarizing what we see here, there's basically three things that people want. It looks like it's really about family and health and money. So working down the list, we have aspects about health and family, and then we come number 15 to 14, you being able to support your family financially, and 15, your financial security. 16 is about family, ability to take care of your family, not worrying about money, having enough money to buy food that you or your family need. So the punchline of our results, people, and this is not surprising, but something that we can show to a new level of specificity in terms of what we mean. People want more health and well-being of their family and of their financial situation. One of the questions people might have is, to what extent are these real results, right? So these are not incentivized, but they are, we think they're meaningful, but they might be presenting not the truth of how people would react to these characteristics. So we have another survey, a follow-up survey that we conducted in 2014 on the same sample of MTurkers who had passed our quality control filter, but kind of a separate process of analysis. We call this an aspect characteristics survey. So I'll show you a question of an aspect characteristic survey question. So this is a screenshot from Qualtrics. It says the characteristic is people downplay wanting it because that might make them look bad. And then the question people are going to rate from 1 to 9 is, would someone downplay how much they want this aspect because openly wanting it might make them look bad? And in the survey, there's a screen like this that would have 20 aspects listed under each question. So we have the respondents rate not in one sitting, but we sample from the 126 aspects and we ask different characteristics like this. So the aspect displayed here is how high your income is compared to the income of other people around you. And so people rate it from not downplay wanting it at all. So that's a 1, that's the lowest level of believed kind of susceptibility of this aspect to a social desirability bias. Like people are not going to downplay this. It's not biased. Versus a 9 would have the highest suspicion of social desirability bias, where the respondent would say people on average would downplay wanting it a lot. So what we do with this data is we make a correction. So the last tables here actually have two corrections. So one correction here is that we have we're using the data for these aspects at the top. We're only using data for the people who have kids or a spouse, respectively, to estimate these. And the corrected rank will multiply by the proportion of people who are in this category. And so that's basically putting a 0 marginal utility weight on everybody who is not in this category. So this is a pretty big or kind of extreme correction, but that's one of the corrections we do. The other correction we do is we regress the rank on the predicted social desirability rating to try to residualize that. So this corrected rank, and corrected marginal utility, so now columns 5 and 6 have done both of those things. So assuming 0 log marginal utilities for people who are not in these categories of having a child and or having a spouse, and residualizing on the social desirability characteristic rating. So what's interesting here is that your children's health is reduced a lot in terms of the marginal utility. It's still large, though. It's still the largest at 12 times as large point for point than the average aspect. The adjustments that we see, though, are to the financial security and finance related aspects. So you not worrying about money goes from 18 in the column 3, unadjusted or uncorrected, and it goes to number 2 after this correction. So I want to be careful we say corrected. This is not to claim that we've got it perfect. One way of thinking about what we're doing here, column 3 is not making any corrections, so it's the most undercorrected. It could be that column 6 actually overcorrects. So for example, if the things that people actually value are correlated with social desirability, which is plausible, then we would be overcorrecting here. So I say corrected, but we want to think of this as the kind of maximal correction we would ever think of is plausible in column 6. So children's health staying at the top, concerns about money, those aspects moving up. In general, the aspects that are about family go from kind of being in the top 10 to maybe the top 20. And then aspects about health go more from being in the top 20 to like the top 30. So out of the 120, they're much more valuable on average, but they're reduced because the financial ones end up being elevated with this correction. So that's because on average, people are telling us that they think other people would be downplaying how much they want those aspects because openly wanting them might make them look bad. One other look at this adjustment and how it changes things. So we have on the x-axis here, the log margin utility. So that's column 2 from the previous table versus the adjusted or corrected log marginal utility. So column 5 from the previous table. And so you can see up in the top right corner, that's the your children's health aspect, which is number 1 either way. And notice it's reported in logs. So that's why it's it goes from 67 points to 12, and in logs that's going here from 4 to about 2. And then we have aspects color-coded. If they're above the line, they're blue. So these are aspects that become relatively more important after the correction. And then those are primarily, a lot of those are money related, although your mental health also has an adjustment. So it was 23 without the adjustment or correction, and it goes to number 5 after correction. So it's not something that people think are going to be overstated. And then the red ones are ones that were in the top 20, but are adjusted relatively downward. The last bit I want to share today is a way of trying to make sense of heterogeneity in log marginal utilities. So basically, interpersonal variation in terms of which aspects of well-being people want the most. And I should say the heterogeneity by demographics is not substantial. So we look at splits, estimating log margin utilities separately by groups. So like men versus women, older versus younger, employed versus not employed, except for MTurk, by racial or ethnic categories. And there are not substantial differences. In fact, for men versus women, we can't reject that the rankings are the same between aspects. So we don't find major demographic differences, but we do find interesting differences by level. So what people want is influenced by what they have. So their current level influences how much they value getting more of the aspect. And that actually follows from economic theory. We would think that observed aspect levels are determined by both the relative marginal utility, the demand for that aspect compared to other aspects, and something that we call supply. So we don't have a full-fledged home production theory to share with you, but the idea is that people could engage in different activities in their life. It could be buying market goods. It could be doing certain activities or practices that would generate these aspects of well-being. And some people might have a harder time generating aspects than others. We would say they have a high marginal cost, perhaps because of their circumstances or their history or their genetics, all kinds of different factors that would be separable from their preferences. So a really simple graph could just show on the x-axis the level of the aspects, and the y-axis could have the marginal utilities and the marginal costs. This is like a supply-demand graph. And if there's variation across people in column A that looks like supply variation, so people differ in their costs of producing the aspects, what you're going to end up with is this negative relationship between the marginal utility and the level. So people who value the aspects more are going to be the people who have lower levels because they're choosing those levels because of the supply constraint. Basically, we say they're supply driven. On the right-hand panel, there's a positive correlation between the level and the marginal utility. And that would be theoretically explained by this variation in demand. So people valuing the aspect more or less is what's creating this difference in the actual levels. So the bottom panels here have actual results from the data. The x-axis here is the level percentile. So we have two different aspects. So you not feeling anxious on the left. So these are the percentile bins of ratings for you not feeling anxious. And then the y-axis is the average marginal utility by the level percentile. So people who are in the lowest percentile and who have a rating of close to 0 on average have that relative marginal utility of about 4 in the top left corner. But we see that negative relationship, and it's estimated to be a slope of about -2. So on average, as people have higher levels, it's correlated with having lower marginal utilities. And that is consistent with a story of a supply-driven aspect. On the right-hand side, an aspect, your enjoyment of risky situations follows the pattern of a demand-driven aspect. So people who value enjoying risky situations can also get risky situations. It seems they're not supply constrained. And so people with the highest levels also have a relatively higher marginal utility. You'll notice the y-axis on that right graph are all negative numbers. That's because we're in because everything is relative to 0. So the average aspect has a marginal utility of 0. So these are not, it's not that they're unimportant, it's not that they're undesired, it's that this aspect is less desired compared to the average. So that's what the negatives mean there. Okay, so we do one more thing with this observation and this theory, which is to try to understand if there's more to the story that other people would see. So we have a theory for why this would happen, but we take this insight to the aspect characteristics survey, and we ask people for each of the aspects. Again, there's 20 aspects in this survey on a screen. Think about people you know who don't care much about getting more of it. So this is prompting them to think about people with a low marginal utility. They might not care much about getting more of it for either of two reasons. One, they already have plenty of it, or two, they don't value it much. For each aspect below of people who don't care about getting more, what fraction have each reason? And we have for here displayed the aspect you not being lonely. So number 1, the lowest rating here, it corresponds to a response almost all of them already have plenty. And then a 9 is almost all of them don't value it much. So that's the survey text. We interpret that with our supply demand lens as a 1 is them saying this, it's supply driven. So the reason why some people don't care about getting more is that they have it. It's a supply issue versus demand. It's that they don't value it. So we have another scatter plot here where on the x-axis is the supply demand score. So the average across respondents who took that characteristic survey, like I just showed the example of. So we have data on that for all of the aspects, 126 aspects. And then the y-axis here is the empirical slope. So the graph that I showed a moment ago with the enjoyment of risky situations sloping up, you can see that supply demand score 6.13. And then the slope on that was close to +2 here. And then the you not feeling anxious aspect has a relatively lower supply demand score, 4.04, and that is consistent with the empirical slope being about -2. So the supply driven aspect. So the aspects that we picked are on kind of the more extreme points, but that is intentional to illustrate the point. Overall, we find it really striking that these variables are so correlated, 0.39 statistically significant from 0. And just to assert or to clarify again, these are separate data collections. So the x-axis is the aspect characteristic survey. It's just that 1 to 9 rating on average of what people say. Is it more that people have enough of it, or is it more that people just don't want it? And then that's on the y-axis, it's the slope of the supply demand graph, the marginal utility versus level graph from the other survey, from the rating and trade-off survey. So we think this is pretty good evidence for supply demand differences across people being a potentially important part of this story. And it also seems that people have some real intuition for why there's differences across people. So to wrap up, just a couple of thoughts here. To conclude again, what people want: family, health, wealth, or money, not necessarily in this order, and not necessarily surprising, but also important that we have some data to back this up, because it's not just what we think or what we think people should want. This is what people are telling us they actually want. The dependence of the margin utilities on the levels, as I was just sharing in the supply demand lens, seems reminiscent of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this idea that as people have something, their needs change or their wants change. And that could be policy relevant too, thinking about the reasons for differences in people affecting what policies might help them. For example, if someone has a low level of a dimension because they don't care about it as much, that would make it less of an ideal policy target, right? We do have some robustness checks that I did not have time to get into. One of the things we do, though, is we compare the estimated marginal utilities to some characteristics questions. So from the characteristics survey, we just ask people directly about how important the aspects are, and we find high correlation there. And then we also have some estimates of marginal utilities, which are in standard deviation units. So the results that I've shared here are all in points. And of course, we don't have natural units. So it could be that we get different results for different kinds of scales or units. But we do find that there's correlation, pretty high correlation between the standard deviation units versus points on the scale. To acknowledge some clear limitations, we have an MTARC sample. It's from the US. It's a single cultural context at one point in time. We would love to answer the big question of what do people want. The consonants across this particular sample, across demographic groups, is perhaps encouraging that we're finding a general pattern, but we are just looking at one data set at this point. And these are stated preferences. We're taking some steps towards correcting for social desirability bias, but we are asking people to imagine their lives in different circumstances, and they're thinking about possibilities they might not have to enact. So the stated preference is, of course, a limitation. In the future, we hope that this method would have all kinds of uses and values. So one thing that could be helpful if we're trying to algorithmically improve well-being, having some enumeration of human goals. What do people want in words? That could be value if we do have natural language processing. And then for well-being science or policy analysis, in the future, using these weights, the log margin utilities as weights, to come up with indices or to just engage in some prioritization across different dimensions could be a useful application. The last thing to mention is that it's a really flexible framework, and that's intentional. So if you want to play around with the wording of an aspect of well-being, or if a government or a policy or a city that's doing a survey wanted to do a different phrasing, right, they could just plug their phrasing into this framework. So we don't mean to say that these are the final answers for all time. This is really a huge research agenda. We think these results are quite robust for this moment, but it's an ongoing question. We'll probably never know the full answer of what people want. All right, so thank you. And that's it for now.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Wow, great talk. My brain is full of lots of thoughts and questions. While people are thinking of questions, Kristen, I just want to ask you one question on that last graph you showed us, where we're looking at sort of whether people thought they were supply or demand driven aspects and whether they really appeared that way. Your children's health seemed like a real outlier, where people expected that it should be maybe supply driven, and it ended up being demand driven, I think, if I'm interpreting it correctly.
Yeah, I can get back. I think I can
insight
get
on that
back to
further.
that and just, yeah, here we go.
Yeah.
Oh,
Thank you.
interesting. Yep. Mhm.
Yeah. Is that like possibly just sort of people who don't have children? I'm not sure how they're going to be responding to that question. Is that what would sort of make it seem like a demand-driven aspect where people expect it to be supply-driven? Any insights on that?
That's right. So people expect it to be supply driven, in that the people who don't have it because, yeah. I don't want to make up a just so story. So I mean, it's a good question. And I think for the aspects that are not as clearly applicable to everyone in the same way, I think that might be part of what you're getting. I think the characteristic question is more ambiguous.
Sure.
We do follow the same procedure for every aspect. But yeah, for aspects that apply differently to different people, that does jump out as maybe being I'm not sure if it would be an interpretation issue. And it is more upward sloping. The upward slope empirically feels to me very plausible, that people people who have kids who care about their kids can then help their kids have higher health.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's right. Okay. What if we let's go over to Kelsey has his hand up. Would you like to unmute and ask a question?
Hey.
Oh, sorry, Smith. Now you can unmute. I thought I had you set up. I think.
There we go. Perfect.
Great.
Thank you. Actually, thank you for calling me next because it goes along with the previous question. So Kristen, I'm trying to wrap my head around this a bit, also with the follow-up question. So the supply and the demand side, I find it very interesting. Where I was thinking about initially for supply side is that it might be difficult for them to attain something. So the marginal cost is difficult, something is difficult to attain. And that's not a question that you address in the follow-up. So if you already have a lot of it or you don't value it, you don't have, is this difficult to attain or too costly, let's say. So you want to get a PhD, but it's too costly for you to attain. So that's one thing I feel like, am I right that this is missing from this follow-up? And maybe you can help me think about this a little bit further. So, my starting point was that this explanation of the supply and demand framework is that you have a low value of something, meaning that when you trade it off versus something else, you have a low value of it. And then you're, as a team, trying to explain why that. And okay, so I have that right. And then the main follow-up was because either they have a lot or they don't value it today. And then, and I'm thinking there may be a third.
Yeah, I think that's right. So the idea, I think there's different ways we could have framed the supply issue, and already having plenty of it is the way this wording. So we have almost all of them already have plenty. This is in part because of specific aspects we're studying. A lot of them do end up being rated pretty high. So, for example, you and your family having enough to eat, I mean, happily that has, I forget exactly, it's a very high mean. And so presumably the reason why people have a high level of that is not because they don't value it, but because they already have plenty of it. So the supply issue could be that they already have a high level, kind of in almost like an absolute term. I think the differences in the cost would possibly dominate for aspects where people had really low levels. Like why don't more people have PhDs? Well, let's fancy everybody would like a PhD, but people just don't want to have, the time is costly or it's a costly activity. So maybe that's part of the story is the framing of the supply could be done in different ways. I know we also have other versions of this characteristic flag where instead of, so this is we call it like a bipolar scale where we have supply on one side and demand on the other side. We do have at least two other questions where we've asked just trying to elicit how much it's affected by supply differences. So I think that it's a good idea to look at that question too. Just to be able to answer your question better. Because I think there's other, your point though, that asking about the marginal cost or costliness directly would probably be really informative.
Having plenty of it is suggestive of being at a different point on the demand curve. Right, so it's still related to demand in my mind, right? So you have a lower marginal value of it because, let's say, diminishing marginal returns. So you're at a different point on the demand curve. It doesn't suggest anything about the supply of this aspect in the world. But I'm thinking about it really as an economist, and where this is a difficult set of aspects we're thinking about here. So I also see, I'll stop now. Miles has also got a bunch typed in the chat.
Oh, I see the chat.
But I'll be
chatter.
quiet.
Okay.
Thank you. It's very interesting stuff.
Thanks.
I'm happy to talk about what I just wrote, but but it's easier if you start by reading it. Well, you don't have to read the whole thing out loud, but I mean, people can individually read it.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Miles, do you have anything to Kelsey's comment about the supply driven label feeling really just like a different point on the demand curve? It does kind of refer to the level more than the cost directly.
Well, I mean, the proof is in the pudding. I think the fact that things that are towards the supply-driven end have a downward slope. Now, we think that supply and demand both have some variance for every aspect. So when we say supply-driven, that's something, you can do the supply and demand analysis, isn't something about the ratios of the variances and the elasticities, but you don't get those slopes very easily without some real action and the thing we've named.
Can I head over to Chris's question, or Kelsey, do you have a follow-up thought there? Okay, great.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, super interesting. Chris, do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks very much for that exposition, Kristen. I wasn't coming into this as concerned about social desirability bias as I was about focusing illusion. Can you tell me something about how you see focusing illusion? And maybe I give just a bit more context, because I think Miles also made a comment comparing this to life satisfaction. So the life satisfaction approach is we don't care what people think is important in their well-being. We don't care what people think would make a difference to their well-being because they're talking about counterfactuals that they haven't experienced. Instead, we rely on asking people who have experienced a given life how that life feels. So that's to me extremely interesting difference here, which I'd love to have your comment on. But the focusing illusion in particular, it seems like we know a lot about how badly people make a mistake of focusing on overvaluing a particular aspect of life when you ask about a counterfactual in which it is different. And so at first I thought, well, this feels a bit like comparing the strength of focusing illusions in different domains. But you also have some things which are of that kind, this would be different as what I would think of as kind of an input. And then some questions are also about the feeling or like worrying about money or happiness of your family, which is pretty close to the subjective outcome for somebody oriented around subjective well-being. So now I've asked probably 3 different questions, but the main theme is to hear what your take is on the focusing illusion.
Thanks. So I'll pick up with the last point you made about inputs and outputs. So we are very agnostic about potential causal relationships between aspects with this approach. And it is, I think, a challenge to get people to think about, okay, what if only this one aspect were different? Because that is the trade-off question we ask them, to imagine only this aspect were different. And I think, so that's cognitively difficult. It might be a difficult thing to do, but that's the spirit of what we're trying to say. Just like the marginal utility of an apple would be like, imagine I gave you an apple and just that one thing. So the inputs and outputs, I think, it would be fair game. So, and something like health could have a high marginal utility, both because it's valuable directly and because it's an input to other things, and that would all get wrapped up in its marginal utility, which is fine, I think, for what we're doing now. The challenge would be if you're doing obviously an index, or if you're combining across dimensions, making sure that the dimensions don't overlap, or that you're accounting for overlap is certainly would be necessary, and it's an added challenge. But just taking things one by one is what we're trying to do. And I like the way you articulated the strengths of the life satisfaction approach, and that you don't have to use weights, and there's nothing hypothetical, right? You're seeing the realized values, self-reported, but still the actual experienced values, hopefully, is what people are giving you. I think Well, I guess I'll give a plug for an older paper from Paul Dolan and Metcalf, which is a dynamic well-being model. And it's not empirical, but I think they do a really good job of putting together, it's called dynamic well-being. I wish I could see people's faces so I can know if people like knew the paper, but they put different indicators in trying to put it in one kind of framework of decision making. And I do think that what we are trying to get at is an idealized preference. So in their model, they start with anticipation or the planning stage. Then people make choices. People realize the effects of those choices. So there's kind of an experience, a hedonic moment, and then people are evaluating them. Maybe that's where a life satisfaction rating would come in. And these are all meaningful measures in the sense that they're telling us something about how people are doing and how they would judge their own well-being. But they're kind of different points of a process, and then people ultimately update their beliefs and kind of have to make their next choice. So there's a dynamic nature to it. I really like that approach, and I think it depends what the users of the data want to do. I do think my sense at least is that there's interest in well-being science and in well-being applications for people to get more granular, like understanding the mechanisms. And I know you can do this with life satisfaction regressions on the left, trying to estimate the partials. But I think this is a different way of getting that. Like, what are the factors that people think matter? So the last thing I'll say to plug the kind of direct approach is that, and the focusing illusion to end with that it is a concern. But if it's picking up something real in the terms of the way people idealize their preferences, or if something were made salient, what would be most important to them? It's almost like a marketing study on life. Like, what are the dimensions of life that people would care about the most if you made them salient? So I think that is a different question maybe than like the whole, the different stage of the process. But I think does that kind of help? I do think that they're part of this, they're related, but they're not necessarily answering the same question. At least that's how I'm thinking about it now.
I mean, one thing I guess is if the focusing factor is same across the different aspects, then you don't have to worry about differential effect of focusing illusion from one aspect to another.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're just getting at, I think, what you want. Sophia has a few seconds left.
Yeah, I'll go really quickly. Thank you so much, Kristen. That was so fascinating, and I missed your talk initially at ISQUAL, so I'm so glad I got to see it. So I have two quick questions. First, and I'm sorry if you already mentioned this, but was there a difference in between how parents versus non-parents evaluated the importance of their children's health? Because in my mind, experience is really important in shaping values and preferences, and so it's fascinating as like seemingly like a very strong kind of social imperative that's common across both parents and non-parents about valuing your children's health. So that's really fascinating to me. And the second question I had was regarding the aspect that went something like you not worrying about money going up as you controlled for social desirability. And to me, it sounds like a proxy for essentially just having all your needs and desires met. So that just being like maybe a general, like maybe a kind of a general aspect for everything that was on that list.
I think that could be, I mean, especially to the extent money is an input to things. Not worrying about money means not worrying about a lot of things. There's things that money can't buy too. So whether that's environmental goods or national public goods or even health, there are limits, right? So I do think especially as people have their own beliefs probably about production functions, like the more important they think money is, the more I think you're exactly right that not worrying about money becomes like just how much possibilities you have in general. I think that's a good point. The children's health piece, also a good point. The marginal utilities, I don't have the number in front of me, but they are lower for people who don't have kids. I know in an earlier version, I think we had an estimate that was lower because we weren't limiting it. In part, we weren't limiting it to people who had kids. And so the jump to it being the 67 points compared to others, that is in part because if you have kids, it's so important. It's interesting that you mentioned like the dynamic perspective though. And so we do have data on how old people's kids are. So we could even look at how, I mean, you could even throw that in there, like how important is it relative to their ages, or just, you know, something looking at the time of it. I do, yeah, I think I'm in the preferences grow, and yeah, I'm kind of in the dynamic everything, I guess, frame of reference for the moment. Thanks for, I know we're out of time. Thanks for the comments. Thanks, Ken, and thanks. I see Miles has put a lot in there, so I don't know if our host can save Miles's comments so that at least we have them. But thank you.
I'm trying to do that. Thank you so much, Kristen. Thank you for the discussion afterwards, and thank you for your great presentation. Thanks, Miles, for chiming in the chat and aloud as well. That's going to bring us to the end for today. Thanks, Kristen. A little round of applause there. Next month, we're going to be back on December 1st with Willem van der Deelkloog, who's a philosopher in definitions of well-being. He's going to talk about, related to this, a pluralistic view of well-being definitions and exploring the possibilities there. So join us then on December 1st. And thank you all for attending today. This was a great discussion. This is a wonderful version of the seminar. It made me very happy. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah.